thanks for joining us today.
Cynthia, thanks for having me.
So we're here to talk about how to get so much older that you need all those lockboxes for all that money. And interesting that you've worked in this startup space on drugs that potentially will extend lifespan. You've started almost 20 companies, I think, in your career.
That's right, yeah.
Interestingly, though, the way the regulatory framework works in the U.S., the regulators are looking for drugs for specific diseases and conditions, cancer, high blood pressure. We've seen obesity in the last couple of years. Where does longevity fit in all of this? How does developing a drug in this space actually, how do you translate that into real life, into drugs that we would actually potentially get at the doctor?
I think in order to answer that, we have to ask the question, what will be the contribution of, am I echoing weird? Does it sound okay to everyone? Sorry. What will be the contribution of all of these discoveries about aging biology to medicine, right? The reason that there's this huge upswelling in interest in longevity, it comes from basic research. People who worked on flies and worms and mice. And now we have 50 plus different interventions that can extend healthy lifespan in mice, for example. It's more than 100 in worms and flies. And so the way that we approach this in terms of building medicines that will be used by humans is asking first, what is the contribution that all of these discoveries is going to make? And the answer there is what we have on our hands is a whole new field of preventative medicines. Because how could you imagine, a drug for longevity? That's not really something that makes sense. But what is a drug for longevity doing? Well, it's preventing cancer and heart disease and frailty and all of the things that kill us. And if we aren't being killed by all of these diseases that happen as we age, then we live longer. And now when you reframe it that way and you're like, okay, well, what we've got is a preventative medicine, a new type of preventative medicine that could prevent multiple diseases of aging, now you're like, it starts to look a little bit more like a real medicine. And so then we can ask a much more realistic question, which is how do you build a company, how do you build drugs that are preventative medicines? And the way that you do that is you identify a patient population who will benefit from these drugs in an acute setting. So from the FDA approval perspective, for example, you need to go through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials, and preventing a disease is a hell of a lot more complicated to show that it works. Possible, but more complicated. And so the way that preventative medicines are usually approved is you test a drug for a specific disease, a specific group of patients that will benefit from that drug, from that mechanism. And then once you know it's safe and effective, then you test it for prevention. So we call that the stepping stone approach to get into a longevity drug. And so all of the companies that I founded in my life, first as an investor and then as kind of a company builder within Cambrian, they all fit this paradigm of finding a drug that can extend healthy lifespan in mice, then turning that into a biotech company going after a specific disease where we can show safety and efficacy. And then step 3 will be, now that that drug is safe and effective at treating a specific subgroup of patients, now can we use it for prevention in a way that maybe everyone in this room or everyone with certain blood biomarkers or after a certain age would want to take it in order to prevent disease. That's how, kind of grounding everyone, I think at the start of this conversation, that's what this whole hubbub about longevity is going to look like realistically for all of us, is new preventative medicines like a statin that lowers cholesterol or like an antihypertensive that lowers blood pressure, but capable of doing so much more and useful for essentially everybody as they age. That's the real thing that's coming down the pipe.
So it's interesting to talk about this in this moment in time because the obesity drugs that came out from Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk in the past couple of years have been, scientifically hailed as game changers, but by the insurance community, there's been a big pushback about paying for expensive drugs that prevent outcomes. So curious where you see this debate going in terms of the likelihood that insurers will pay for it, since that's the biggest sort of access point and hurdle.
So we could really talk about this up and down. Let me first say that these obesity drugs are really good drugs, right? They really work well to reduce weight in a country where 40% of our population is obese. And every health economist will tell you that there is no more cost-effective way of kind of reducing overall costs in the healthcare system than through prevention. And it looks like reducing obesity has sort of positive knock-on effects in heart disease, in stroke, in diabetes, kind of all over the place. However, the way the American healthcare system is constructed is that the average time that a patient stays on their health insurer, I'm curious, since we have a lot of financial folks in the room here, it's only about 3 years. And so when someone is jumping to a new health insurer every 3 years, the game of the private health insurers is, it's like a game of hot potato. Why would we pay for prevention when we're not going to reap the benefits of prevention 10 plus years down the line? And so as part of the Affordable Care Act, and again, we're getting really deep into things, so I apologize. But as part of the Affordable Care Act, there was a group established called the USPMTF, U.S. Preventative Medicines Task Force, whose job it is to go in and evaluate preventative medicines. And if the data is good enough, then Medicare and all private insurers are forced to cover that. So that's kind of the pathway for a preventative medicine generally. The debate that's going on right now in the obesity space is whether these new obesity drugs even have to go through that USPMTF pathway, because that takes a long time. The amount of evidence that needs to be gathered is huge. With this obesity drug, or with these obesity drugs, there's this fascinating path where obesity has been kind of called, at least by the FDA, kind of called a disease. And so should insurers cover drugs for all diseases? Obesity is not really a disease in like the traditional way that we look at it. What it is it's a risk factor for multiple diseases like heart disease and so on and so on. But by framing it as a disease, that was certainly enough for the FDA to grant approvals. And the question is, will the insurance companies grant approval or reimburse around obesity as a disease state? If it does, it makes my life a lot easier, because having sort of biomarkers, if you will, like high BMI, is a great way for us to approve aging drugs and get those reimbursed. So, I mean, it's hard to look into this as like a crystal ball, but my view is that because these obesity drugs work so well, because every person who is overweight is either doing, like, getting their insurance to cover them now, or doing cash pay. About 40% of the sales of these drugs right now are cash pay. And because they work so well, the insurance system will cover them sooner or later. The question is, how much work do the big companies have to do in order to get them approved? But the health economic sort of case for this is super clear. Prevention is much more cost effective than waiting for people to have a heart attack or a stroke or need dialysis or something like that. That's way, way more expensive. It's just kind of how our system works right now.
And given the political climate we're in, and we've heard from a lot of things from RFK around diet and exercise being paramount to fixing the chronic disease crisis in America, where do you think the conversation is going to go in terms of drugs as treatments for some of these things? I think there's sort of kind of conflicting narratives in some ways.
So you don't get into the startup world without being a bit of an optimist. And so when I was called up by a bunch of reporters to kind of comment on, well, what do you think RFK and the new administration is going to do with this longevity space? And my view is that the science has just matured to a degree that no matter which side of the political spectrum you're on, you can't ignore this. Like this is just, in my view, the most exciting area of drug development and academic science that exists today. And so I think that the focus of the incoming administration on diet and exercise can kind of go one of two ways. It can either go in an anti-science direction of like, we don't want to touch medicines, but my sincere hope is that it'll go into a really positive strain, which is how can we get in front of disease, right? We do have a chronic disease epidemic in this country. We do we have food and exercise patterns that are not healthy for us. Those things can all be improved, but they won't be enough, right? We know from clinical trial after clinical trial that trying to impose diet and exercise regimes on people is not enough. We can nudge the system here and there, but the mentality behind saying, hey, diet and exercise are important is the same mentality that I'm using to come and say we need new preventative medicines for these chronic diseases of aging. The question is, if you'll let me, I know we're already kind of diverging, but the way I like to look at it is that we are evolved to become obese, right? If you look around the tables that you're all sitting in right now, how many pastries and sugar-filled things have we spread out there? Because we as humans love those things. We have evolved over the last 200,000 years to be programmed to take every bit of extra sugar that we can find and put it into our bodies because we do not know when the next famine will come. And it's only been in the last couple of hundred years that that has not been a problem for the majority of humans. And so now I think we have sort of two options. We can either play sort of a victim blaming game of well, hey, it's our fault that we are attracted to sugar. It's our fault that we can't control our appetites and so on. So be more disciplined. But what we know in clinical trials is that that doesn't work very well. And then the alternative is to say, okay, well, how can we use science and the progress that we've made in understanding human biology to sort of reprogram ourselves to fit better in this new world that we as humanity have created. And that kind of framing in terms of sort of correcting or accelerating our evolutionary biology instead of blaming the victims, I say victims in air quotes, instead of blaming a person who has trouble getting up and exercising, has trouble not overeating, et cetera, why couldn't we create a medicine that makes that person more energetically active, that makes that person less hungry, like these obesity drugs? That's sort of a really interesting direction in terms of this big idea of how can we make humanity better suited to the world we have created that humans are living in. And so, anyway, it's a long way of answering your political question, but I think that's just sort of the direction that's being approached from both sides of the spectrum.
It's a nice segue into describing your lead candidate and what it does. How would you break it down for the layperson in terms of the type of science you're looking at and the role of metabolic health?
So the furthest along drug that has come out of this aging biology space in terms of clinical trials is a drug that I have the pleasure of sort of overseeing in its development. It's a drug, I don't know how many of you guys work in this, work or have looked at this space, but drugs always have three names, right? They have their brand name, they have their generic name, and before they get that, they have their code name. And so this drug is still in the code name stage. It's called ATX-304. And it does something really cool. It activates a pathway called AMPK and mitochondrial respiration, which are the two things that are responsible for declining in age that reduce our metabolism. So if you could, most of us think back to our teens and 20s where you can kind of eat anything and never gain any weight. And then all of a sudden, 30s, 40s, 50s, you're like, ooh, my body is changing a lot. The reason that change happens is that our ability to activate AMPK and energy metabolism in the muscle goes down. And so we found a drug that can boost those things back up. And so you give it to a mouse or even a dog, and we see their level of energy expenditure just rise up 10, 15%. It's almost like some free exercise that you get in a pill every day. And with that increase in energy expenditure, their control of glucose, so their ability to get diabetes and so on, basically it gets so much better. You cannot give these mice diabetes. Even if you destroy their pancreas, they have no insulin, they will still not get diabetes because they're controlling their glucose so well. You put them on a high-fat diet, and even though their appetite doesn't decrease, in fact, if anything, it increases a little bit because they're like, Tour de France cyclists or something like that, using so much energy and then eating more and more and more, their weight will actually decrease. It kind of chews away from the fat, but not the muscle. Interesting versus the obesity drugs. And so anyway, we have this drug which works beautifully in mice, beautifully in dogs, and we're now in sort of the second stage of human clinical trials. We have a trial reading out for this drug actually in just a month and a half. So I joke that I'm running Schrodinger's company, that my company's either alive or dead, and I just haven't, I don't get to open the box with these blinded studies for a couple more months.
So Eli Lilly also has rights to a similar drug. If you both succeed, how would you compete against the makers of Zepbound?
So Lilly has a collaboration with a company called Nimbus for a preclinical AMPK activator. We don't know whether it also activates the mitochondria. Again, this is a high-level conversation. I don't want to get too deep into it, but these pathways that are important in aging biology, they're not brand new pathways. They're often like the most important parts of cell biology. I like to call it getting into the guts of cell biology and tweaking those things in a way to reprogram sort of a old dysfunctional pattern to a young, more functional pattern. And both on the AMPK side and the mitochondrial activation side, big pharma companies have tried to activate these pathways for years. In fact, there have been 5 different drugs that were developed in mice and in cells that activate AMPK. All of them turned out to be toxic because they would drug development is like using a really blunt instrument, right? You come into the cell and you're like, I'm going to hit this thing as hard as I can to turn this pathway on or off. And when you turn that AMPK pathway on too hard with a blunt instrument, it actually causes too much sugar to go into the cell. And then it actually inflates the cell. The sugar precipitates. Anyway, we don't have to get into the scientific details, but like it causes toxicity based on having too much sugar inside the cell versus outside. And so one of the magical things about these researchers studying longevity is that every discovery that sort of rises to the top has come into these really complex pathways and sort of tweaked and tuned them in a way that sort of resets them to a level of a youthful animal instead of coming in with this big sort of pharma hammer. And that's kind of been the theme of my career, is how can we, instead of a light switch turning a pathway on or off, how can we come in and use sort of a dimmer switch theme in biology? And that's sort of the magic of what this academic community has done, and kind of what our drug has done. But in any case, that's all aside from your question of what happens when we get these drugs approved. And a new AMPK drug would basically be the complement of the obesity drugs that exist today. The obesity drugs that exist today, they reduce appetite. They're almost like a crash diet, right? They make you stop eating, you start losing fat, you're also losing muscle at the same time. If you pair that with a drug that increases energy expenditure, then two really cool things happen. The first is if you pair it with the fasting drug right away, then you're both fasting and using more energy in your muscles. That prevents the muscle mass loss and increases the rate of fat loss in your body, number one. And then number two, most people only take these obesity drugs for about a year, and then they roll off. They're tired of the nausea, they're tired of not eating, et cetera, et cetera. And maintaining a person on these energy expenditure drugs for 2, 3, 5 years, that's going to be probably more what the paradigm looks like. And so you could imagine a situation where if I'm BMI 40, right, if I'm way overweight, I'll take both drugs at the beginning, lose 20 to 30% of my body weight, and then drop the GLP-1, drop the fasting drug, and then maintain myself on sort of a youthful energy metabolism, maybe as long as I'm around.
And do you envision a time where someone who maybe doesn't have a BMI to qualify for an obesity drug might get a drug like this for these benefits?
So that's really the dream, right? I like to call obesity the metabolic shortcut, looping all the way back to the start of our conversation of how you get preventative medicines approved, right? Obesity is kind of like preventative medicine already, but it's just for a subsection of the population who are already obese. And so as we're doing obesity trials, we're going to be looking at cancer rates, Alzheimer's rates, in addition to heart disease and diabetes rates that happen in these obesity patients. And as soon as you get enough data, all it takes is just to make one shift and run an additional trial in non-obese patients in a preventative medicine study to see if you can prevent heart attacks and strokes and these sorts of things that happen in non-obese people as well. And so it's like, it's one extra step, but it's not that far of a step from saying, hey, let's just recruit obese versus non-obese people. So it's going to come if this thing works.
Well, there's a lot for us to keep an eye on. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for your attention, everyone.
Cool.